Some deaths are quick, some are painful, but a few are so cruel that surviving them feels impossible. Imagine being torn apart by a wild animal in the middle of nowhere, then realizing the real horror hasn't even begun yet. Because the people you trusted don't help you. They don't stay. They dig your grave and walk away. What followed shouldn't have been survivable, and yet somehow it was. If you're sensitive to real-life tragedy, you may want to stop here. The story exists in a space between documented history and frontier legend, shaped by time, repetition, and survival. Some elements were recorded by men who witnessed the aftermath, while others were passed down through retellings that blurred fact and folklore together. But one truth remains constant across every version. A man named Hugh Glass was attacked in the wilderness and deliberately abandoned by those he depended on. Very little is known about Hugh's early life. Records from the late 18th century are incomplete, and his childhood remains almost entirely undocumented. He was likely born somewhere in the eastern United States, possibly Pennsylvania, though even that detail is uncertain. What is known is that by the time he appeared in reliable historical accounts, Hugh was already hardened by hardship, accustomed to danger, and capable of surviving in environments that broke most men. Some stories place Hugh at sea during his early adulthood. Others claim he crossed paths with pirates operating along the Gulf Coast, forced into a life of violence and theft before eventually escaping inland. Whether those events happened exactly as described is impossible to confirm, but they contribute to the image of a man who lived without stability and learned quickly that survival required adaptability. At some point, Hugh lived among native tribes for several years. During that time, he learned how to survive in the wilderness rather than fight against it. He learned to read animal tracks, conserve energy, locate water, and endure hunger without panic. These skills were not learned from books or instruction, but from observation, repetition, and necessity. They would later determine whether he lived or died. By the early 1820s, Hugh joined a fur trading expedition traveling deep into the American frontier. These expeditions were grueling and dangerous, pushing men into unexplored territory for months at a time. They faced extreme weather, limited food, disease, and the constant risk of violent encounters. Trust within these groups was essential, but it was also fragile. The expedition encountered hostility more than once. In one incident, what began as a peaceful trade suddenly turned violent. Several men were killed, others wounded, and the survivors escaped only by chance. Despite the losses, the expedition continued forward. Turning back carried its own dangers, and survival often depended on momentum. In the summer of 1823, a small group was sent ahead to scout for game near the fork of a river. Hugh Glass was among them. The forest was dense, and visibility was limited. Sound traveled unpredictably through the trees. Hugh moved cautiously, scanning for movement and signs of animals. Without warning, he stepped around a tree and came face to face with a grizzly bear. It was a mother bear, accompanied by her cubs. The charge was immediate and unstoppable. Hugh had no time to aim his rifle or escape. The bear struck him with overwhelming force, knocking him to the ground. Claws tore into his flesh, and her jaws clamped onto his body. He was lifted, shaken, and thrown aside repeatedly. Accounts differ on how the attack ended. Some claim Hugh managed to wound the bear before collapsing. Others say nearby men rushed in and killed it. Regardless of the details, when the attack ended, Hugh Glass was still alive, though barely. His injuries were catastrophic. His back was torn open, exposing muscle and bone. His scalp was severely damaged. His throat had been ripped so deeply that air escaped visibly through the wound when he tried to breathe. He could not speak, and movement was nearly impossible. The nearest settlement was hundreds of miles away. The men who found Hugh believed he could not survive. Still, they attempted to help. A stretcher was built, and Hugh was carried through rough terrain. Each mile slowed the group further. Supplies diminished, and the risk of attack increased with every delay. Eventually, the decision was made to leave him behind. 2 men were selected to stay with Hugh until he died. They were instructed to bury him and then rejoin the expedition. Extra pay was offered to anyone willing to remain. One man was older and experienced. The other was only 19 years old. They stayed behind. They gave Hugh water and watched his labored breathing. Days passed, and his condition worsened. Fever set in, and infection spread through his wounds. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to speak or move. Believing death was inevitable, the two men dug his grave. Then they left. They took Hugh's rifle, knife, and supplies, believing he would no longer need them. They walked away, convinced the wilderness would finish what the bear had started. But Hugh Glass did not die. After days of fever and darkness, his condition began to stabilize. His mind cleared enough for him to understand what had happened. When he examined his wounds, he saw that maggots had infested the decaying flesh. As horrific as it was, he left them there, recognizing that they were consuming dead tissue and preventing worse infection. Hugh survived by instinct alone. He drank water carefully and crushed berries into paste so he could swallow them. When he managed to kill a snake, he consumed it raw. Fire was impossible, and standing was out of the question. Still, he began to move. Hugh dragged himself forward inch by inch across dirt, stone, and roots. Days blended together. Nights were long and cold. Every sound suggested danger. Every shadow carried the threat of death. His goal was a distant trading fort more than 200 miles away. Weeks passed. Some accounts suggest Hugh received brief assistance from others along the way. Other versions claim he survived entirely alone. Regardless, against all reason, Hugh Glass reached civilization. Those who saw him were stunned. He looked like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. After recovering, Hugh learned that the men who abandoned him were still alive. His rifle was gone. The betrayal burned deeply, fueling a determination that refused to fade. Hugh returned to the wilderness once again. When he finally caught up with the expedition, the remaining men were shaken. They had been told he was dead. One of the men responsible for abandoning him had joined the army, placing himself beyond immediate retaliation. The younger man stood frozen as Hugh approached. Hugh raised his rifle. Then he lowered it. Seeing the young man's fear and remorse, Hugh spared his life. The rifle, however, remained missing. Later, Hugh encountered the other man at a military fort. Killing him there would have meant execution. Accounts differ on whether Hugh threatened him or forgave him, but Hugh ultimately reclaimed his rifle. Years later, Hugh Glass was killed during another expedition, finally overtaken by violence in the wilderness he had survived so many times before. Whether every detail of his story is true no longer matters. At its core, this is a story about abandonment, endurance, and refusal. A man was left to die, buried before he was dead, and survived through sheer will. Sometimes the most disturbing horror is not the wilderness itself, but the moment people decide someone is no longer worth saving.